Hi, I'm Ashley Bevan, and today we're checking out Historic Boulder's main event of the year. It is called Meet the Spirits, and it's such a cool thing to do. You get to meet all of the different characters that had a big hand in forming the area, building Boulder, the Wild West. It's a very cool thing to do, so come and check it out.
I'll start out by saying everything that I'm going to talk about today it comes from my autobiography, Tom Horn, Government Scout and Interpreter, not some of these other movies and books you've seen. I wrote this book while I was in prison waiting to be hung. I was born in Scotland County, Missouri in 1860, not 1861 like the stone says. I stayed there till I was about 13, and then I ran away from home. The reason being, for some reason, my father thought I should go to church, and he thought I should go to school, and I didn't like doing either of them. And when I didn't do those things, he would beat me up. So after a while, I didn't want to take that anymore, and I lit out after stealing his gun and his horse, and went to St. Louis, where I worked as a teamster for a while. Eventually, went on down to Santa Fe, where my older brother was, and worked as a teamster down there too. And while I was down there, I learned the Spanish language, which at the time they were calling it the Mexican language down there. Did that for several years, and I caught the eye of a guy named Al Sieber. You may have heard of him. He's a famous Indian scout, worked for the Army down there, and helped track down the Apache Indians that were leaving the reservation. And while I was working for Al, I actually learned the Apache language as well, and met Geronimo several times. And it was very helpful when General Crook, who was the commander at the time, finally tracked down Geronimo. I was with that party, but if it wasn't for me, Geronimo would have never surrendered to General Crook. And the reason being is General Crook could only speak English. Geronimo could only speak Spanish or Mexican and Apache. So I was the interpreter, and I was the one who convinced Geronimo to actually surrender. Geronimo liked me enough that he gave me a name called Talking Boy, because I could speak 3 languages. So after the Apache Wars, I stayed down in Arizona, worked as worked on a cattle ranch for a while. Actually had my own small cattle ranch for a bit, and that's where I first ran into cattle rustlers, and that's very important to remember because I'll talk more about them later. Stayed down there for a bit, also did a little sheriffing down there, got tired of that, came on up here to Colorado where I worked in some mines up in Cripple Creek, Leadville, and Gunnison. And that's hard work. Being a miner is hard work, and I decided, well, I'm best at tracking people and tracking things. So I got on with the Pinkerton Detective Agency. You might have heard of them as well. Quite a famous group. I think they're still around. Anyway, I brought in a lot of bad men for them, but after a while I got a little tired of that. Anybody have an idea how come I got tired of that? Do we have any lawyers here?
You shot a lawyer?
A number of those bad men I brought in, some silver-tongued, sharper lawyer would get them off, and they'd go on and commit another crime, and I'd have to go get them. So after a while, a lot of the good number of the men I brought back in were draped over to the side of a saddle and not riding a horse. So that made the Pinkertons look bad as well, and they weren't too pleased with that. So it was about that time that the Spanish-American War started, and I got hooked up with Teddy Roosevelt. I was never a Rough Rider, but he employed me as a teamster running his pack mules and horses and that supply trains and that kind of thing. And if it wasn't for me, Teddy Roosevelt would have never made that famous charge up San Juan Hill and ended the Spanish-American War. Because you see, when we loaded all those mules up in Florida on those big ships, there was a modern port, big gangplanks, and the mules went right up those gangplanks. When we got to Havana Harbor, there was no such modern port, and all they had were these little narrow gangplanks to walk down, and the mules refused to go down those gangplanks. So I came up with the idea, why don't we just throw them over the side, because they'll swim to shore. And that's exactly what we did. When they swam to shore, we rounded them up, got all those supplies for Teddy Roosevelt in time for him to make that famous battle. So you see, if it wasn't for my idea, he would have never made that charge. So after the Spanish-American War, I came back and I worked for the Pinkertons for just a little bit more, and I was actually working up in Browns Park up in northwest Colorado, tracking down Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now, I never did catch them, but during that time I ran into a guy named Coble, who was part of a big ranch up in Wyoming called the Swan Cattle Company, with several other big ranchers up there. And they were being plagued by rustlers. And as I mentioned before, I never had much high regard for rustlers because I had experienced them stealing cattle from me. And I kind of looked at rustlers like you would a rabid dog. You know, just shoot them and get it done with, and it's done. So they hired me as a cattle detective. Not a gunslinger. I was never a gunslinger, although that reputation seems to follow me. And after I'd been working for a while, or what a cattle detective did, was he would go around, or ride around out in their ranches and just make sure that nobody was stealing cattle. And if he did, he was allowed to arrest them or get rid of them. So after I started, two fellas who were suspected cattle rustlers, a guy named Walker and then later on a guy named Thomas, were found shot. But I had been seen in the area a day or two previous to that, but they never pinned those deaths on me. However, there's a couple of more famous people that you might have heard of. A group of cattle rustlers headed by a fellow named Isham Dart were suspected of robbing cattle. And what I would do, especially with somebody like him, I'd put a note on their cabin door saying, "You better leave the country or you're going to be killed." Well, Isham Dart didn't take heed of that, and neither did some of his cohorts. But they had seen me in the area, so they holed up in a cabin for about 3 days. And when they hadn't seen me at all, they decided it was safe enough for them to leave and go out and about their business. So Isham Dart's the first one who comes out of the cabin, and somebody shot him right in the forehead and killed him dead. Now the other 5 guys saw this and ran back in their cabin and stayed there for another 3 days and left poor Isham laying out in the corral. And then they decided they were going to make a break for it. They got their horses and they left the country. Smart idea. Some people say because they were worried I would make a confession and implicate some of my former employers about being hired to shoot rustlers, which I never did. So I walked up the steps of the gallows with Sheriff Cahill and this guy Proctor that we had overpowered and another deputy, and they put me on the trap door. Now this was a new type of gallows. It's called the Julian gallows, named after the fellow who invented it, and it didn't require anybody to pull a lever to open the trap door. What it did was, when the condemned person was standing on the trap door, it would pull a lever, and that would pull a stopper or a cork out of a barrel of water. And when enough water came out of the barrel, and the barrel weighed less than the condemned man, the gallows would open, and the man would actually hang himself. Now, as you might see, I have a wound here. This is a real wound. But when I was dropping through the gallows, it didn't break my neck. What happened was the hangman's knot hit me so hard it knocked me out, and I strangled to death, and it took 16 minutes for me to die. So luckily I was knocked out.